My husband's new girlfriend giggled as she clinked glasses with him at our anniversary dinner. Neither realized that just hours earlier, I had finalized the sale of his family's 3-generation business to their biggest competitor. The text. Confirming the wire transfer had arrived while I was applying my lipstick for the dinner he had insisted we keep, as friends. The reservation was for 7:30 p.m. at Bellini's, the upscale Italian restaurant where David had proposed to me 5 years ago. I arrived precisely on time, my attorney's congratulatory champagne still warming my veins, my signature on the closing documents barely dry. I spotted them immediately. David's arm draped possessively around a woman who couldn't have been more than 25, her cascade of blonde hair bouncing as she laughed at something he said. The same table where he had once promised me forever now hosted his betrayal. Before I share what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I have something extra special planned just for you. I smoothed my black dress, the one David always said made me look too serious for his networking events, and approached their table with measured steps. His face when he saw me flickered between guilt and relief. Perhaps he'd expected me to cancel, to avoid the humiliation of meeting the woman he'd left me for just 6 weeks earlier. Rebecca, he stood awkwardly, kissing my cheek as though we were distant acquaintances. You remember I mentioned bringing someone? He hadn't mentioned anyone, but I nodded anyway, extending my hand to the young woman. I'm Melissa, she offered brightly, her handshake limp. David's told me so much about you. It's so amazing that you guys can still be friends. I felt my lips curve into the same smile I'd perfected during business meetings with David's father over the last month. The smile that revealed nothing while I orchestrated the sale of Brighton Automotive Supply right out from under the family that had never truly accepted me as one of their own. David's always been good at compartmentalizing, I replied, sliding into my seat. If he noticed the double meaning in my words, he didn't show it. Instead, he launched into a story about their recent weekend getaway, apparently oblivious to the significance of the date, April 12th, our 5th wedding anniversary. The anniversary he had texted me about just last week, suggesting we still celebrate as friends, because some things are worth honoring. What David didn't know was that while he'd been posting sunset pictures with Melissa from some beachfront hotel, I'd been in his father's office, leveraging the business degree they'd both dismissed as my cute hobby. Old Mr. Brighton had never approved of me, had never believed I was good enough for his son or knowledgeable enough to offer insights on the family business. You run the charity events, dear. Leave the real business to those who understand it, he'd told me at the last company Christmas party, patting my hand condescendingly as David laughed along. They never knew I'd spent those 4 years of marriage meticulously learning every aspect of Brighton Automotive Supply, building relationships with their clients and suppliers, understanding their vulnerabilities in the market. They'd been too busy dismissing me as David's wife to notice I was taking notes at every family dinner discussion about the business. So Melissa's starting her influencer career, David announced, bringing me back to the present. Her fashion content is really taking off. Melissa beamed, tucking her hair behind her ear to reveal a diamond earring I recognized, part of a set David had given me for our 2nd anniversary. I'm focusing on luxury lifestyle, she explained earnestly. David's been such a mentor. I sipped my water, nodding appreciatively while mentally counting down the hours until the Brighton family would discover what I'd done. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. David had never attended, claiming the operational details bored him. He preferred to enjoy the profits and prestige of being a Brighton without the responsibility, leaving his father and uncle to manage the company his grandfather had built. Mentor, I echoed. David certainly has a talent for identifying opportunities. I glanced at my watch, the vintage Cartier his mother had given me when we married, a family heirloom I'd contemplated returning, until I realized how much more satisfying it would be to wear it today. The waiter arrived with menus, and David ordered a bottle of Barbaresco without consulting either of us. It was the same wine we'd had the night he proposed. I wondered if Melissa knew that, if she realized she was just the newest participant in David's habit of recycling romantic gestures. Rebecca's been keeping busy too, David offered magnanimously after ordering. She's got her little foundation. Work. Always had a soft spot for the underdogs. Melissa nodded sympathetically. That must be so rewarding, helping people and everything. My little foundation work had actually positioned me perfectly to understand the charitable giving structure of Brighton Automotive, including the significant tax advantages Mr. Brighton had engineered through corporate donations. The same structure I'd explained in detail to Westfield Industries when they approached me about acquisition possibilities. The same tax situation that had made my asking price so appealing when I suggested they could streamline operations by absorbing Brighton's client base rather than maintaining the redundant infrastructure. It is rewarding, I agreed, unfolding my napkin. Understanding how systems work, finding the leverage points where small actions can create significant change. David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it dismissively before turning it face down. Dad, he explained unnecessarily. Probably some business thing that could wait until Monday. I imagined Mr. Brighton's increasing panic as he received the first legal notifications, his attempts to reach his son, who was too busy showboating for his new girlfriend to answer. The same son who held 27% of company shares but had signed over his proxy voting rights to me to avoid being bothered with that boring stuff during our marriage. A legal arrangement he had apparently forgotten in the whirlwind of his new relationship. You should call him back, I suggested, my tone light. It might be important. David waved his hand dismissively. He just wants to complain about the competition again. Westfield's been aggressive lately, but Dad's paranoid they're planning some hostile move. It's our anniversary dinner. Well, you know what I mean. Work can wait, Melissa giggled, squeezing his arm adoringly. David says his dad is totally stuck in the old ways of doing business. So resistant to change. I smiled, thinking of how rapidly change was about to come to Brighton. Automotive supply. Change can certainly come as a shock when you're not prepared for it. The waiter returned with the wine, and David performed his usual show of tasting it with exaggerated expertise. A ritual he'd learned from a YouTube video but presented as family knowledge passed down through generations of Brighton men. Perfect, he declared, then raised his glass. To new beginnings. Melissa raised her glass eagerly. I lifted mine more slowly, the weight of the day's events, of the past 6 months of careful planning, making the moment feel surreal. To reaping what you sow, I offered instead. David's smile faltered for just a moment before he clinked his glass against mine. He had never been particularly perceptive, too wrapped up in his own narrative to notice the undercurrents. It was what had made the last few months possible. His absolute certainty that he understood how the world worked, how I worked. As Melissa launched into a story about her recent brand collaboration, I felt my phone vibrate in my purse. A text from Julian, my attorney. Second set of papers filed, everything proceeding as planned. I slipped my phone back into my purse, smiling at something Melissa said while internally counting down the hours until tomorrow's revelation. The Brighton family was about to discover that the daughter-in-law they had underestimated, the wife, their son had discarded, understood far more about business, about loyalty, and about power than any of them had ever suspected. And David, raising his glass across from me with that familiar confident smile, had no idea that by this time tomorrow, the family legacy he took for granted would belong to someone else. The company that bore his name would be absorbed by their largest competitor, its assets redistributed, its workforce reorganized, its family heritage erased from the market it had once dominated. He had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, oblivious that I had just sold his family's business out from under him. And as I sat there, listening to them plan a future built on the foundation of my humiliation, I savored the knowledge that some betrayals come with consequences. neither of them could imagine. The appetizers arrived: calamari for David and Melissa to share, caprese salad for me. I watched as he fed her a piece from his fork, the same performative affection he'd shown me in the early days. Back when I believed his family's automotive supply empire was built on business acumen rather than the connections and old money that had actually sustained it for 3 generations. "So, Rebecca," Melissa attempted conversation, perhaps sensing the undercurrent of tension beneath my calm exterior. "David says you worked for the family business for a while, in marketing or something." David chuckled, swirling his wine. "Community relations." Rebecca organized the charity galas and handled the PR side of things. He turned to me with that familiar patronizing smile. "You were good at making the company look generous." What neither of them understood was that my position had given me access to everything: financial records, client contracts, supplier agreements, tax structures. While they dismissed me as merely planning parties and writing press releases, I had been mapping the entire operation, understanding its strengths and vulnerabilities with a clarity that even old Mr. Brighton lacked. "Someone had to add value beyond the balance sheet," I replied, my voice neutral. "Your father always appreciated my perspective." David's expression flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty before the confidence returned. His father had never appreciated anything about me except my ability to make the Brighton name look charitable in the local business community. The galas I organized had brought in significant tax advantages and community goodwill, but in the Brighton family hierarchy, such work was considered decorative rather than essential. "Dad's old school," David explained to Melissa, "big on community image." Rebecca was perfect for handling that side of things. Perfect. The word echoed as I remembered the night 6 weeks ago when he'd told me our marriage was over. "You're perfect," he'd said, "just not perfect for me anymore." He'd delivered this line with practiced sincerity, as though he'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror. Perhaps he had. That same night, after he'd left to give me space, actually to meet Melissa at a hotel downtown, though I hadn't known that. Yet, I'd opened his laptop to search for any clues about what had really happened to our marriage. Instead, I found emails from his father expressing concern about Westfield Industries' recent market moves. Old Mr. Brighton had suspected they were positioning for some kind of acquisition. He was right, of course. He just hadn't realized the acquisition would come through me. "Your father called again," I noted as David's phone buzzed for the 3rd time. "It seems urgent." David silenced his phone with an exaggerated sigh. "He's probably overthinking the quarterly projections again. The man can't relax even on weekends." He turned to Melissa. "Dad still uses actual paper ledgers alongside the computer systems, refuses to fully trust digital records." I smiled at this familiar complaint. Edward Brighton's distrust of computers had been a running family joke, but it had actually been a prudent business practice. His careful paper documentation had given me the final pieces of information I needed when planning with Westfield. The digital systems showed the company's official position, but the handwritten notes in Edward's office revealed the reality, including the significant cash flow problems Brighton Automotive had experienced over the past 2 years. Problems that David, with his executive title but minimal involvement, knew nothing about. "Your father has always been careful," I observed. "It's why Brighton Automotive survived when so many similar businesses failed." Melissa nodded enthusiastically. "David's going to modernize everything when he takes over. He has amazing ideas about expanding into new markets." I took a deliberate sip of wine, letting the irony of her statement wash over me. There would be no taking over for David. By this time tomorrow, Brighton Automotive Supply would exist only as a subsidiary of Westfield Industries, its assets being integrated into the larger corporation structure, its name relegated to a small division that would likely be rebranded within a year. And the new ideas she referred to? I'd heard them all during our marriage. Grandiose plans without concrete steps, Ambitious visions without practical implementation strategies? The same pattern that had characterized our relationship: sweeping promises followed by disappointing execution. David has always been visionary, I agreed, watching him preen at the compliment. Less interested in day-to-day operations. That's what managers are for, he replied with the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never had to worry about making payroll. A Brighton should focus on the big picture. The irony of his statement might have made me laugh if the stakes weren't so serious. The big picture at Brighton Automotive now included a sale agreement with provisions specifically excluding David from any management position in the restructured company. Westfield's CEO had been particularly amenable to that condition, having encountered David at industry events and formed his own assessment of the Brighton Air's business capabilities. Speaking of the big picture, Melissa interjected, her eyes bright with excitement. Should we tell her our news? David hesitated, glancing at me with what might have been a flicker of guilt. Maybe not tonight, babe. Oh, she pouted playfully. I thought since you two are still friends. I set down my fork. Please, don't hold back on my account. David cleared his throat, suddenly very interested in rearranging his silverware. It's nothing formal yet, just thinking about possibilities. Melissa couldn't contain herself. We're looking at properties in Milan. David's going to open a European division of Brighton Automotive, and I'll launch my fashion brand there. It's perfect synergy. The European expansion? Of course. It had been our dream once. A plan we'd discussed on lazy Sunday mornings, mapping out how Brighton Automotive could establish a foothold in the European market. I'd spent months researching regulations, tax implications, and potential partner companies. All that work compiled in a detailed proposal that David had presented to his father as his own creation. Edward Brighton had rejected it as too risky, too expensive, too removed from their core business. David had been furious, interpreting his father's practical concerns as a personal rebuke. Now he planned to resurrect the idea with Melissa by his side instead of me, apparently without any understanding of how Brighton Automotive's new ownership would affect his plans. Milan is beautiful, I said mildly, though the regulatory environment for automotive supply companies in Italy is particularly complex. David waved away my comment. We'll have people to handle those details. The Brighton name will open doors. The Idoia Brighton name. He still didn't understand that a name was worthless without the substance behind it. The Brighton name that had once commanded respect in the industry would soon be an afterthought, a footnote in business articles about Westfield's strategic expansion. Of course, I murmured. The Brighton name has always been your greatest asset. I set down my glass carefully. Ownership can be such a complex legal concept, especially in family businesses with complicated structures. The night I discovered David's affair had changed everything. After finding the text messages and hotel receipts, I'd sat motionless in our darkened living room, reevaluating not just our marriage but my entire position within the Brighton empire. For years, I'd poured myself into supporting their business, only to be treated as an accessory, useful for appearances, but not worthy of genuine respect. That night, I'd remembered a conversation with Julian Morrison, Brighton Automotive's corporate attorney, during last year's Christmas party. Slightly drunk on expensive scotch, he'd explained how David's grandfather had structured the company to protect it from outside acquisition. The ownership was divided between family members in a way that required consensus for any significant change. A hostile takeover would be impossible, Julian had boasted, unless someone managed to acquire proxy rights from multiple family members simultaneously. Someone like the wife who held David's power of attorney. Someone who had spent years cultivating relationships with his elderly aunt in Phoenix who controlled 13% of the company shares. Someone who had earned the trust of his cousin Michael, whose gambling debts made his 9% stake vulnerable to the right offer. Someone who understood that his father's 31% combined with these other shares would constitute a controlling interest, someone they had all underestimated. "Rebecca," David's voice had a warning edge now. "What have you done?" Our main courses arrived, the timing almost comically perfect. The waiter placed the osso buco in front of David, who didn't even glance at it. Melissa's mushroom risotto and my branzino completed the tableau of domestic normalcy that had become absurdly disconnected from the conversation happening at our table. "I've simply helped Brighton Automotive transition to new ownership," I replied, once the waiter had departed. "The company needed fresh capital and strategic direction. Westfield Industries provided both." "You can't do that," David hissed, leaning forward. "You don't have the authority." I removed a small folder from my purse and slid it across the table. "Actually, I do. Power of attorney for your shares, remember? Signed when you were too busy to handle the boring paperwork during the Jensen acquisition. Never revoked." I gestured to the documents. "Plus agreements from Aunt Eleanor and Cousin Michael. All completely legal, I assure you." Melissa looked bewildered. "What's happening? David, what is she talking about?" David ignored her, leafing through the papers with increasing agitation. "This is insane. You can't sell a company out from under its owners." "I didn't sell it out from under its owners. I sold it with the documented consent of shareholders representing 49% of the company. Combined with your father's shares, which he signed over once I demonstrated the company's actual financial position and Westfield's offer." I let the sentence hang. "Dad would never sell," David insisted, his voice hollow with uncertainty. "Your father is a pragmatist at heart. When presented with evidence of Brighton Automotive's true financial situation, not the sanitized version you receive at holiday dinners, he recognized that Westfield's offer represented the best outcome for everyone." I sipped my wine, calmly, especially once he understood the alternative. The alternative had been a detailed presentation of how Brighton Automotive's precarious cash position would become public during the divorce proceedings, how the company's practice of inflating assets to secure operational loans would inevitably come to light, how decades of Edward Brighton's creative accounting would be scrutinized by financial and legal authorities. Dad agreed to this? David's voice had lost its assertive edge, confusion replacing anger. "Signed the papers this morning." I nodded, toward my phone. "Those calls from him?" "Probably trying to reach you before I told you myself. He seemed to think you might take it better coming from him." Melissa set down her fork with a clatter. "Would someone please explain what's going on?" David turned to her, his face ashen. "She's saying she sold my family's company, the business my grandfather built, our entire legacy. But why would you do that?" Melissa directed the question at me, genuine confusion in her eyes. I considered her for a moment. Perhaps she truly didn't understand what she had participated in. The humiliation David had subjected me to. The casual cruelty of discarding our marriage while expecting me to quietly accept my replacement. "For the same reason Brighton Automotive's executive board approved the sale this afternoon," I answered. "Because it was the financially responsible decision for all stakeholders." David's phone buzzed with incoming messages. Likely his father providing confirmation, or perhaps other family members beginning to learn what had happened. He ignored it, his eyes locked on mine. "You planned this," he said slowly. "All of it. For how long?" "Since the night you left," I admitted. Though the groundwork was unintentionally laid much earlier, by you, by your father, by everyone who encouraged me to handle the feminine side of the business while excluding me from real decision-making. The irony was that if anyone had bothered to verify my credentials, they would have discovered that before marrying David, I had specialized in corporate restructuring and mergers. My little foundation work had come later, a compromise to appease the Brighton family tradition of wives focusing on charity rather than commerce. What they had perceived as willing compliance had actually been strategic patience. "So this is revenge," David concluded, his jaw tight. I shook my head slightly. This is business. Westfield offered fair market value plus a premium. The sale includes provisions protecting current employees through the transition. Your father and the other family shareholders will receive substantial compensation. I paused. Your personal shares as well, naturally, though your executive position has been eliminated in the new structure. David's face flushed with anger. You had no right. I had every legal right, I interrupted calmly. As your wife, as your authorized proxy, and as someone who understands Brighton Automotive's actual value better than you ever bothered to learn. Melissa's eyes widened. Wait, wife? You said you were already divorced. Another lie in David's carefully constructed narrative. Our separation had been too recent for the divorce to be anywhere near finalized, another detail he had conveniently omitted when crafting his new relationship. We're separated, David muttered, not meeting her eyes. The divorce is in process. 6 weeks into the mandatory separation period, I clarified, which coincidentally began the same week you two started seeing each other. Melissa's expression shifted as she processed this information, recalculating the timeline of their relationship against what David had told her. I almost felt sorry for her, another woman deceived by his selective presentation of facts. So, you're not even legally separated yet? She asked him directly. It's a technicality, he insisted, his attention split between his crumbling personal narrative and the business catastrophe unfolding simultaneously. The divorce is happening. Yes, I agreed, though the division of assets may be more complicated now. The sale proceeds from your Brighton Automotive shares will need to be addressed in the settlement. David's face went from red to white as the full implications sank. Not only had his family business been sold without his knowledge, but his own financial stake in the transaction would be subject to division as marital property. You can't do this, he repeated. But there was no conviction in his voice now, just the dawning realization that not only could I do it, I already had. It's already done, I confirmed. The contracts are signed. The initial payments have been transferred. The board has approved the transition plan. I closed the folder and slid it back toward my side of the table. Brighton Automotive Supply is now officially a division of Westfield Industries. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it, scrolling through a series of messages with increasing agitation. Whatever his father was telling him was confirming everything I had said. What about Milan? Melissa asked in a small voice. The European expansion? I smiled sympathetically. I believe Westfield already has offices in Frankfurt and Barcelona, but they have no plans for Milan at present. David pushed his plate away untouched, his appetite apparently gone. You've destroyed my family's legacy. No, I corrected gently. I've secured your family's legacy. Brighton Automotive was 3/4 away from bankruptcy, David. Your father has been keeping the company afloat through personal loans and creative financing for the past 2 years. I leaned forward slightly. This way, the Brighton name remains on the subsidiary division. The employees keep their jobs. Your family extracts the remaining value before the market decline makes that impossible. It's actually the best possible outcome. You expect me to believe you did this for the good of the company? His voice dripped with skepticism. I did it for exactly the same reason you brought Melissa to our anniversary dinner, I replied, my voice finally betraying a hint of the anger I'd suppressed. Because I could. The silence that followed my statement hung between us like a physical presence. Around us, Bellini's continued its elegant dinner service, soft murmurs of conversation, the gentle clink of silverware against fine china, servers moving with practiced efficiency between tables. Our private drama remained contained within our little triangle, though several nearby diners had begun to notice the tension radiating from our table. Melissa was the first to break the silence. I think I should go, she said quietly, reaching for her purse. Her earlier enthusiasm had evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that she'd been drawn into something far more complex than she'd realized. No, David reached for her hand. "Stay, please." There was a note of desperation in his voice I'd never heard before. The confident, casually cruel man who had dismissed our marriage was suddenly facing the loss of both his newest relationship and his family legacy. Simultaneously, "I'll get the check," I offered, signaling to our waiter. "We're not finished here." David's voice hardened as he turned back to me. "You can't just drop this bomb and walk away." "Actually, I can," I replied calmly. "The transaction is complete. The contracts are executed. Your father has been fully briefed on the transition plan, which begins Monday morning with the official announcement to employees and stakeholders. This isn't about the business." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This is about us. About our marriage? About how things ended." I regarded him with genuine curiosity. "Is that what you think? That I orchestrated a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition as an emotional response to your affair?" His silence confirmed that was exactly what he thought. The familiar arrogance, assuming my actions must revolve around him, around us, around emotions rather than strategy. "David," I set my napkin beside my plate. "What happened to our marriage was unfortunate but ultimately irrelevant to this transaction. Brighton Automotive was heading toward insolvency. Your father has been hiding the true financial position from you and the other family shareholders for years. The choice wasn't between keeping or selling the company. It was between an orderly, profitable sale now, or a chaotic, devalued bankruptcy within a year. That's not possible," he insisted, though doubt crept into his expression. "Dad would have told me if things were that bad." "Would he?" I raised an eyebrow. "The same man who still keeps handwritten ledgers to track the real numbers separate from the official financial statements? Who insisted I sign an NDA before allowing me to handle the charitable foundation's accounting? Who has been systematically overvaluing company assets in loan applications for the past 3 years?" David's face paled further. "You're making that up." I reached into my purse again, retrieving my phone. When your father realized I knew the truth, he became remarkably cooperative. I pulled up an email and slid the phone across the table. "This is his formal authorization for the sale, sent yesterday after our final meeting. You'll notice he specifically mentions the Jensen contract loss and the failed Parkman acquisition. Both disasters he carefully kept from you because he didn't want to worry his son with operational problems." David scanned the email, his expression shifting from disbelief to confusion to the beginning of anger. "He never told me any of this." "Of course not," I said gently. "You were the golden son, the heir to the Brighton legacy. Protecting that image was more important to him than sharing the truth." Melissa sat awkwardly, clearly unsure of her place in this unfolding family drama. "Maybe I should call an Uber," she murmured. "The car service will take you anywhere you need to go," I told her, surprising both of them with the courtesy. "I've already arranged it." The waiter arrived with the check. I handed over my credit card without looking at the total. One final dinner at Bellini's seemed an appropriate closing expense for this chapter of my life. "I still don't understand," David said after the waiter departed. "If the company was in trouble, why didn't you or Dad come to me? I could have helped find investors, explored partnerships, like you helped with the European expansion proposal." I interrupted. "The one I spent 6 months researching, that you presented to your father as your own work, only to abandon the project completely when he raised concerns?" His silence was confirmation enough. "Your father didn't come to you because he knew you had neither the expertise nor the commitment to address structural business problems," I continued. "And I didn't come to you because from the moment you decided our marriage was over, you made it abundantly clear that my input on anything, personal or professional, was no longer welcome." David ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, disrupting its perfect arrangement. "So this is my punishment? For ending our marriage? For moving on with Melissa?" I sighed, the weight of his persistent misunderstanding finally testing my patience. "This is consequence, not punishment," You treated both our marriage and your family company as accessories, things that existed to benefit you without requiring genuine effort or commitment in return. The dissolution of both is simply the natural outcome of that approach. The waiter returned with my card and receipt. I signed it, adding a generous tip. None of this was his fault after all. What happens now? David asked, an unfamiliar vulnerability in his question. On Monday, Westfield Industries announces the acquisition. Your father retires with the honorary title of Chairman Emeritus. The Brighton name remains on the automotive division for at least the next fiscal year. Employees receive retention packages to smooth the transition. I meant with us, he clarified. With the divorce. I tucked the receipt into my purse. Our attorneys will continue the process. Your shares in Brighton Automotive no longer exist, but the proceeds from the sale will be addressed in the settlement. I've already instructed my lawyer to be reasonable about the division of assets. Melissa shifted uncomfortably. I really should go. The car is waiting outside, I told her. The driver has instructions to take you wherever you need. She stood, gathering her wrap and clutch. Thank you, she said quietly, then turned to David. I'll talk to you. Later. The hesitation spoke volumes about her uncertainty regarding their future. After she left, David and I sat in silence for a moment. Around us, Bellini's continued its elegant Friday evening service, other couples celebrating ordinary anniversaries, engagements, promotions, the regular milestones of lives not in the process of dramatic reconfiguration. You really did it, he finally said, a note of reluctant admiration in his voice. You outmaneuvered all of us. I protected my interests, I corrected. Something your family taught me to do, though perhaps not in the way they intended, he shook his head slowly. You know, Dad always said you were smart. Too smart, he called it. Said I should be careful not to underestimate you. Apparently neither of you took his warning seriously. David's phone buzzed again, another call from his father. This time he answered, stepping away from the table for privacy. I watched as he paced near the restaurant's entrance, his gestures becoming increasingly agitated as the conversation progressed. I used the moment alone to send a quick text to Julian, confirming that everything had proceeded according to plan. His response came immediately. All executed perfectly. Westfield transferring first payment as agreed. Congratulations. David returned to the table, his expression now a complex mixture of anger and resignation. Dad confirmed everything. He said you were right about the company's position, that you actually negotiated a better deal than he could have. I nodded, unsurprised. Edward Brighton was many things, but ultimately he was a businessman who recognized reality when confronted with it directly. He also said I should have listened to you more, David added, a reluctant acknowledgement. About the business, about everything. Your father has always been practical when necessary, I observed, standing and gathering my things. A quality worth emulating. As I prepared to leave, David reached for my wrist. Rebecca, wait. We should talk about this more. About what it means for us, for the divorce. I gently removed his hand. There's nothing more to discuss. The business transition has been arranged. Our personal transition is in our lawyer's hands. I met his eyes directly. I have a car waiting as well. That's it? After 5 years of marriage, you just walk away? The irony of his question, coming from the man who had ended our marriage with a practiced speech about outgrowing each other, was almost enough to make me laugh. Instead, I simply gave him the truth. You walked away 6 weeks ago, David. You just didn't expect me to move forward without your permission. As I turned to leave, he called after me. The Brighton name meant something. It was my heritage. My future. What am I supposed to do now? I paused, looking back at him one last time. That's entirely up to you. For the first time in your life, you'll have to build something on your own, without your family name opening doors. I offered him a small, genuine smile. You might find it rather liberating. Outside, the spring evening was mild, cherry blossoms, from nearby trees occasionally drifting down to dust the sidewalk. My driver stood beside the car, opening the door as I approached. Behind me, Bellinis glowed warmly against the gathering dusk, the scene of both the beginning and end of my relationship with David Brighton. As the car pulled away, I felt a curious lightness spreading through me. Not vindication or triumph, but something quieter and more profound. The awareness that I had finally stepped fully into my own power, reclaiming not just my financial security, but my fundamental sense of self-worth. David had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, unaware that I had just sold his family's business. But the real surprise, for him, for his family, and perhaps even for me, was discovering who I truly was when I stopped allowing others to define my value. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine, my closest friend who had supported me through the darkest days after David's betrayal. Is it done? Are you okay? I typed back a simple reply as the car merged into the evening traffic, carrying me toward whatever came next. It's done. And for the first time in years, I'm perfectly okay. The weekend passed in a strange calm, like the eye of a hurricane. I knew the storm would resume Monday morning when Westfield Industries made their official announcement, but for these brief 48 hours, I allowed myself to simply breathe. I spent Saturday morning sorting through the personal items I'd left at the Brighton family's lake house, mainly books and a few sentimental objects from early in our marriage. The caretaker had packed everything in neat boxes, clearly following Edward Brighton's instructions to be thorough but respectful. I'd chosen this weekend deliberately for the retrieval. The Brighton family would be dealing with the business crisis, not relaxing at their vacation property. As I loaded the final box into my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. Brunch tomorrow? I want to hear everything. Sunday morning found us at the Terrace, a quiet bistro overlooking the city park. Catherine arrived 15 minutes. Late as usual, breathless and unapologetic. Sorry, she said, dropping into the chair opposite mine. The kids had their swimming lessons, and then Mark couldn't find his wallet and... She stopped abruptly, studying my face. You look different. Different how? I sipped my coffee, curious about her assessment. Lighter, she decided. Like you've set down something heavy you've been carrying. Perhaps she was right. The weight of my connection to the Brighton family, the constant effort of fitting myself into their expectations while being systematically undervalued, had been exhausting in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. So, Catherine leaned forward eagerly after ordering her mimosa. Tell me everything. How did David react? Was there a scene? Did the girlfriend cry? I smiled at her enthusiasm. Catherine had despised David since our second year of marriage, when she'd overheard him explaining to a colleague that my business degree was just something to keep her busy until we have children. Her loyalty during these past difficult weeks had been unwavering. It was surprisingly anticlimactic, I admitted. David was shocked, then angry, then almost impressed. Melissa was mainly confused, then embarrassed when she realized she'd been lied to about our divorce status. That poor girl, Catherine said without much sympathy. Though anyone who begins a relationship with a married man shouldn't be surprised when dishonesty follows. The waiter arrived with Catherine's mimosa and took our food orders. Once he departed, she raised her glass in a toast. To new beginnings, she offered. I clinked my coffee cup against her flute. And to authentic endings. Have the call started yet? She asked. From the family, the employees, the social circle? A few texts from peripheral people, probing for information without being direct. Edward's wife called last night, surprisingly cordial considering the circumstances. I stirred my coffee thoughtfully. She said she'd suspected the company, was in trouble for years but could never get a straight answer from Edward. And Edward himself? Radio silent since Friday's meeting. He's probably working with the Westfield team on the transition announcement. Catherine nodded, clearly disappointed by the lack of drama. And how are you really feeling about all of it? Not just the business sale, but seeing David with her, at your anniversary dinner of all places. That had to hurt. I considered her question carefully. It should have hurt more than it did. But seeing them together just confirmed what I'd already accepted, that our marriage had been built on mutual misunderstanding. I thought I was in a partnership. He thought he had acquired a supportive accessory for the Brighton lifestyle. And the business? Do you feel victorious? Vindicated? Again, I found my emotional response more complex than anticipated. Not victorious, exactly. The sale was genuinely the right business decision. Brighton Automotive was heading toward a crisis that would have affected hundreds of employees. This way, most jobs are preserved, creditors are paid, and the Brighton family extracts significant value before the company's position deteriorated further. Catherine studied me over her mimosa. You're being very rational about something that most people would turn into a revenge story. I smiled at her characteristic directness. Perhaps there was an element of satisfaction in being the one to execute the sale they never saw coming. But it wasn't about punishing David or his family. It was about finally using all of myself, my intelligence, my education, my business acumen, without apologizing or downplaying my capabilities to make someone else comfortable. Our food arrived. Avocado toast for Catherine, a simple omelet for me. We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before she spoke again. What will you do now, after the divorce is finalized? It was the question I'd been considering most over the quiet weekend. The sale proceeds from my work with Westfield had secured my financial independence, but money had never been my primary motivation. I've had an interesting offer, I revealed. Julian introduced me to Victoria Chen at Westfield. She's impressed with how I handled the Brighton acquisition and wants me to consider a position in their corporate restructuring division. Catherine's eyebrows shot up. You'd work for the company that absorbed Brighton Automotive. Isn't that, complicated? It might be if the position were directly related to the former Brighton operations. But Victoria's team handles new acquisitions, helping integrate them into the Westfield structure. I speared a piece of omelet thoughtfully. It would be using my actual skills rather than planning charity galas and writing press releases about the Brighton family's community spirit. And what about the foundation work? You seem to genuinely care about those causes, even if the position was beneath your capabilities. She was right. Despite the frustration of being relegated to the feminine side of the Brighton business empire, I had formed genuine connections with the community organizations we supported. I'm establishing my own foundation, I explained. Smaller but more focused on educational opportunities for women in business. The divorce settlement will include a clean break from the Brighton Family Foundation. Catherine nodded approvingly. You've really thought of everything. I've had 6 weeks of sleepless nights to plan, I replied with a wry smile. Amazing how clarifying betrayal can be for focusing one's priorities. After brunch, we walked through the park, the spring sunshine warming the air as families played on the grass, and couples strolled hand in hand along the pathways. There's something I haven't told you, I admitted as we paused by the ornamental pond. About David and Melissa. Catherine turned to me with renewed interest. Oh? The night I discovered their affair, when I found the messages on his laptop, I also found their planned itinerary for the next few months. Weekend trips, dinner reservations, and a jewelry store appointment scheduled for next week. I tossed a small pebble into the water, watching the ripples spread. He was planning to propose to her, Catherine, before our divorce was even filed, let alone finalized. That absolute bastard, she breathed, righteous indignation on my behalf, replacing her usual composed demeanor. Please tell me the jewelry store appointment was for a ring he can no longer afford? I smiled slightly. The Brighton family isn't destitute. The sale was actually quite generous. Edward negotiated well once he accepted the inevitability of the transaction. But yes, I imagine David's immediate plans might require some financial recalibration. Good, Catherine said with fierce satisfaction. Let him feel some consequences for once in his privileged life. We continued our walk, the conversation shifting to Catherine's children and her husband's recent promotion. It felt refreshingly normal to discuss ordinary life events after weeks of elaborate strategy and careful timing. As we prepared to part ways in the parking lot, Catherine hugged me tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Not just for the business coup, but for reclaiming yourself in the process." Her words stayed with me as I drove home, the afternoon sun creating dappled patterns through the trees that lined the boulevard. I had spent 5 years of marriage gradually making myself smaller to fit within the Brighton family's expectations, moderating my intelligence, deflecting recognition for my contributions, accepting David's casual dismissal of my capabilities as though it were an endearing quirk rather than a fundamental disrespect. The sale of Brighton Automotive hadn't been about revenge. It had been about reclamation of my professional identity, my self-respect, and my unwillingness to remain complicit in my own diminishment. When I arrived home, a bouquet of lilies waited on my doorstep. My favorite flowers, though not the roses David had habitually ordered on autopilot for every occasion. The small card attached bore Victoria Chen's name and a simple message. "Looking forward to our meeting tomorrow. The business world needs more women who understand their own value." Inside my apartment, I placed the flowers in water, their subtle fragrance filling the living room as I prepared for the week ahead. My lawyer had already drafted the final settlement proposal for the divorce, equitable but firm, with no room for the emotional manipulation that had characterized so much of my marriage. The Westfield announcement was scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow, after which my phone would likely explode with calls and messages from people throughout the Brighton social and business circles. For now, though, the evening stretched before me with a peaceful solitude that felt not lonely but luxurious. I opened the book I'd been wanting to read for months, a biography of a female industrialist who had built her company against overwhelming odds in the 1950s, and settled into my favorite chair. My phone chimed with an email notification, Edward Brighton, with the subject line, "Tomorrow." I hesitated before opening it, preparing myself for recriminations or legal threats despite our seemingly amicable parting on Friday. Instead, his message was brief and unexpected. "Rebecca, while I cannot pretend to be pleased with how events have unfolded, I find myself compelled to acknowledge your business acumen. The terms you negotiated with Westfield are more favorable than I would have achieved under the circumstances. David never appreciated what he had, in you or in the company. That was his mistake, and perhaps mine as well for not recognizing your capabilities sooner. Good luck with whatever comes next. Edward." I read the message twice, surprised by both its content and its tone. Edward Brighton had never been one for sentimental expressions or admissions of error. This acknowledgement, however grudging, represented perhaps the most genuine respect he had ever shown me. I typed a simple reply. "Thank you, Edward. I wish you well in your retirement." Then I set aside my phone, returning to my book and the quiet anticipation of tomorrow's new beginning. Outside, the spring evening settled gently over the city. From my window, I could see the Brighton building illuminated against the darkening sky, still bearing the family name, at least for now. Tomorrow would bring changes for everyone connected to that legacy, but none more significant than my own transformation from overlooked wife to architect of my own future. David had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, unaware that I had just sold his family's business. But the real story wasn't about what I had taken from him. It was about what I had reclaimed for myself. The Monday morning announcement from Westfield Industries came precisely at 9 a.m., a meticulously worded press release that managed to present the acquisition of Brighton Automotive Supply as both a strategic business decision and a harmonious transition. The statement included quotes from Edward Brighton about ensuring the company's legacy through strategic partnership, and from Westfield's CEO praising the distinguished history and market expertise that Brighton Automotive brought to their corporate family. What it didn't mention was the company's precarious financial position, the hasty negotiations, or the soon-to-be ex-wife who had orchestrated the entire transaction. Some stories remained better left untold in the official corporate narrative. I sat in Victoria Chen's sleek corner office at Westfield headquarters, watching the business news channels pick up the announcement. The ticker along the bottom of the screen showed Westfield's stock price already ticking upward as market analysts recognized the strategic value of the acquisition. "They're running the press release almost verbatim," Victoria noted, her sharp eyes tracking the coverage on multiple screens. "Financial analysts will start issuing their assessments within the hour. We're expecting uniformly positive responses." Victoria was exactly as Julian had described her. Brilliant, precise, and refreshingly direct. In her mid-50s, with a sleek silver bob and impeccable tailoring, she had built Westfield's corporate acquisition division from a 3-person team to the industry powerhouse it was today. When Julian had mentioned my situation and capabilities to her, she had immediately recognized the opportunity, both for Westfield to acquire Brighton Automotive and for her team to potentially gain a new member with insider knowledge of family business dynamics. "Edward Brighton is handling the employee announcement personally," I informed her, checking my watch. "That should be happening right now at Brighton headquarters." I could imagine the scene, the large conference room where quarterly results were typically presented, now filled with anxious employees as Edward explained the transition with whatever narrative he'd constructed to maintain his dignity. The Brighton family had always excelled at presentation management, carefully controlling which aspects of reality were acknowledged publicly. Victoria nodded approvingly. "Your insistence on that point was wise. Employees tend to respond better when familiar leadership delivers transition news, even if that leadership is departing." She studied me thoughtfully. "You have good instincts for the human elements of corporate restructuring. Most financial strategists focus exclusively on balance sheets and market positions. 5 years as the Brighton family's public relations coordinator taught me the importance of narrative management," I replied, "and how message delivery affects implementation success." My phone began vibrating incessantly as the news spread. Calls from former colleagues, family connections, social acquaintances, all suddenly discovering that Brighton Automotive was no longer under family control. I silenced it without checking the screen. Those conversations could wait. "Speaking of implementation," Victoria continued, pulling up a document on her tablet, "I've drafted a formal offer for the position we discussed. Director of Family Business Acquisitions, a new role, reporting directly to me." She slid the tablet across her desk. "The compensation package reflects both your expertise and the value you've already demonstrated in the Brighton acquisition." The figure on the screen made me blink twice to ensure I wasn't misreading it. Nearly triple my highest salary at Brighton Automotive, plus performance bonuses and equity options that could potentially double that amount annually. "This is extremely generous," I said, reviewing the details. Victoria's smile was slight but genuine. "It's market appropriate for the specialized skills you bring. Westfield has been trying to expand our portfolio in the family-owned manufacturing sector for years. Your combination of financial acumen, relationship management capabilities, and first-hand understanding of family business dynamics is precisely what we need." She leaned forward slightly. "And I appreciate working with people who recognize their own value." The contrast with my experience at Brighton Automotive couldn't have been more stark. There, my contributions had been consistently minimized, my expertise treated as a convenient bonus rather than essential expertise. Here, my capabilities were being recognized, valued, and appropriately compensated without requiring minimization of my identity in the process. I'd like some time to review the details, I replied, though in truth the decision was already made. Of course. Take the weekend if you need it. Victoria checked her watch. I have a board call in 5 minutes. Feel free to use this office to review the offer or make any calls. Jennifer will show you out when you're ready. She stood, extending her hand. Whatever you decide, Rebecca, it's been a pleasure working with you on the Brighton acquisition. You outmaneuvered a room full of experienced businessmen who underestimated you at every turn. I find that quite impressive. After she left, I remained in her office, the multiple screens still displaying coverage of the acquisition. A financial news channel had managed to get a comment from David, clearly ambushed outside his condominium building. His normally perfect appearance was disheveled, his expression caught between anger and confusion as he offered a terse, "No comment," before escaping into a waiting car. I finally checked my phone. 27 missed calls, 46 text messages, and dozens of email notifications. I scrolled through them quickly, noting with mild interest which friends and acquaintances had reached out. Most messages expressed versions of confusion or concern, though a few contained thinly veiled requests. For insider information about the transaction, one message caught my attention, from Patricia Brighton, David's mother. Unlike Edward, who had at least grudgingly acknowledged my business capabilities, Patricia had never shown me anything but cool tolerance during our marriage. Her text was characteristically brief. "We should talk. Lunch at the club tomorrow?" I considered declining, but curiosity won out. What could Patricia possibly want to discuss now that the transaction was complete and my separation from David nearly finalized? I texted back a simple acceptance, then turned my attention to Victoria's job offer. The position was perfect, challenging, lucrative, and directly utilizing the skills I'd honed during my years with the Brighton family. Yet I hesitated, wondering if accepting would appear to confirm David's accusation that everything had been about revenge. My phone rang again, Catherine this time. I answered, welcoming the distraction from my thoughts. "It's all over the business news," she exclaimed without preamble. "They're calling it the acquisition surprise of the year. One analyst actually said, the Brighton family never saw this coming, if only they knew." I smiled at her enthusiasm. The announcement went smoothly. Victoria Chen just offered me the position we discussed. The director role? Rebecca, that's fantastic. When do you start? I haven't accepted yet, I admitted. I'm still considering. Catherine's silence spoke volumes before she finally responded. Please tell me you're not hesitating because of what David or his family might think. Her directness was exactly what I needed. Maybe I am, I acknowledged. Taking the position feels like confirming their narrative that this was all an elaborate revenge plan. Stop. Catherine's voice was firm. You didn't create this opportunity. You recognized and leveraged it. The fact that Westfield wants to hire you proves this was about business, not emotions. Don't let the Brightons' interpretation of your motivations influence your professional decisions. They've controlled enough of your choices already. She was right, of course. Declining a perfect position to avoid confirming David's suspicions would be allowing him to influence my future just as he had my past. You're right, I said finally. I'll call Victoria tomorrow to accept. Good. Now, tell me about this lunch with Patricia. What do you think she wants? I have no idea, I admitted. Possibly to berate me for betraying the family, or perhaps to understand how it all happened under their noses. Either way, it should be an interesting conversation. After ending the call with Catherine, I gathered my things and left Victoria's office, nodding to her assistant on my way out. The Westfield headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a downtown tower, its lobby featuring a massive sculpture of interlocking geometric forms that symbolized the company's various divisions coming together as a unified whole. I paused before it, appreciating both its artistic merit and its aspirational messaging. Impressive, isn't it? I turned to find Edward Brighton standing behind me, looking older than he had just 3 days ago when we'd finalized the sale documents. The strain of the transaction and its aftermath had etched new lines around his eyes. Edward, I kept my voice neutral, genuinely surprised by his presence. I didn't expect to see you here. Final details on the transition team, he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the elevator bank. Westfield's integration process is remarkably thorough. They've requested I stay on as a consultant for the first quarter. I nodded, unsure what response he expected. Our business was concluded, our personal connection all but severed. Patricia mentioned she's meeting you for lunch tomorrow, he continued, his tone carefully casual. So that was it. He was checking my intentions regarding his wife. Yes, she reached out this morning. Edward shifted uncomfortably, his usual commanding presence diminished in the aftermath of the company sale. She's taking this harder than expected. The social implications, you understand. The Brighton name has always carried certain expectations in our circles. I'm aware, I replied, thinking of the countless charity events where I'd been expected to represent the Brighton legacy, with appropriate deference and gratitude for my inclusion. Rebecca, he seemed to be struggling to find the right words. I hope you'll be discreet in your conversation with Patricia about the company's financial situation before the sale, about David's role, or lack thereof, in the business operations. I studied him, recognizing the familiar Brighton concern with appearances over substance. Even now, with the company sold and the transition underway, Edward was focused on managing perceptions rather than acknowledging realities. I have no intention of causing Patricia unnecessary distress, I assured him. But I won't lie if she asks direct questions. He nodded, accepting this as the best assurance he was likely to receive. The board presentation you put together for Westfield was impressive. I hadn't realized you had such a comprehensive understanding of our operations. The compliment, however reluctant, represented a significant shift from the man who had once introduced me at a business dinner as David's wife. She handles the charity work, without even using my name. I've always paid attention, Edward. That's the difference. He acknowledged this with a slight inclination of his head. Victoria Chen mentioned she's offered you a position here. News traveled quickly in corporate circles, especially when someone had reason to pay attention. She has. Will you take it? I considered his question, recognizing that my answer mattered to him not for my sake, but for what it might mean for the Brighton family's ongoing relationship with Westfield. I haven't decided yet, I replied, though Catherine's advice had already settled the matter in my mind. But if I do, you can be assured that I'll maintain appropriate professional boundaries. Regarding Brighton Automotive's integration, relief flickered across his features, quickly masked by his usual composed expression. I never doubted your professionalism, Rebecca. Whatever else has happened. The statement was revisionist history at its finest. Edward Brighton had consistently doubted and dismissed my professional capabilities throughout my marriage to his son. But pointing this out now would serve no purpose except petty satisfaction. Good luck with the transition, Edward, I said instead, stepping toward the revolving doors that led to the street. I'm sure Westfield will value your expertise during the integration process. Outside, the spring sunshine cast long shadows across the plaza as business people hurried to and from lunch meetings. I paused, gazing up at the glass tower that housed both Westfield Industries and what remained of Brighton Automotive Supply. The building reflected the blue sky and passing clouds, its surface appearing both solid and ephemeral simultaneously, much like the corporate legacies it contained. My phone buzzed with a text from David. We need to talk. About the company. About us. About everything. Please. I didn't respond immediately, considering what possible conversation could remain between us. The business transaction was complete. Our marriage was over. The only remaining connection was the legal process of divorce, which our attorneys were handling efficiently. Yet something in his request gave me pause, not out of lingering affection or obligation, but from the recognition that proper closure might benefit us both. David had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, unaware that I had just sold his family's business. Now that both revelations had been fully processed, perhaps one final conversation would allow us to truly close this chapter. I texted back a brief response. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. The park bench by the lake. A public place with personal significance, where he had first proposed, and where I would now definitively conclude our story on my own terms. The Greenwich Country Club hadn't changed in the 5 years I'd been coming here as David's wife, and then as a Brighton family member. The same pristine greens stretched toward the horizon, the same understated luxury permeated every corner of the clubhouse, and the same attentive staff greeted members and their guests with practiced deference. What had changed was my relationship to this carefully cultivated world. Patricia Brighton sat at her usual table on the terrace, angled perfectly to catch the midday light while offering a commanding view of both the golf course and the arriving members. Her posture was impeccable as always, her ash-blonde hair swept into the same elegant updo she'd maintained for 20 years. At 65, she remained a formidable presence in the social circles that had defined her entire adult life. She noticed my approach with the heightened awareness of someone who had spent decades monitoring social dynamics. Her expression revealed nothing as she rose slightly to accept my perfunctory kiss on the cheek. "Rebecca, thank you for coming." She gestured to the chair opposite hers. "I've taken the liberty of ordering your usual salad." The fact that she remembered my regular order, mixed greens with grilled chicken, dressing on the side, struck me as both thoughtful and slightly manipulative. Patricia Brighton had always excelled at such small demonstrations of personal attention while maintaining emotional distance. "Thank you, Patricia," I replied, settling into my seat. That was considerate. A waiter appeared immediately with iced tea for both of us, then discreetly retreated. Patricia took a deliberate sip before speaking. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here." "I am curious," I admitted. "Our business connection has effectively concluded, and our personal relationship was always—" I searched for a diplomatic phrasing. "Formal," she supplied with a small, knowing smile. "Yes, I'm aware I wasn't the warmest mother-in-law. The Brighton family has certain traditions, certain expectations about who joins our circle. I was simply protecting our interests." The familiar justification, family traditions, Brighton expectations, had been invoked countless times during my marriage to David. It had excused everything from my exclusion from key business discussions to Patricia's subtle undermining of my charitable initiatives. And now those interests have been fundamentally altered, I observed. Patricia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed. Which brings me to why I asked you here." She set down her glass with precision. "I want to understand how you did it." The request surprised me. I had expected recriminations, perhaps guilt manipulation, or even financial negotiations regarding the divorce settlement. Curiosity about my methods hadn't featured in any of my anticipated scenarios. "How I orchestrated the sale, you mean?" She nodded. "Edward provided the broad strokes, something about proxy voting rights and financial leverage. But he's been uncharacteristically reticent about the details, almost embarrassed, which isn't like him at all." Our salads arrived, providing a moment to consider my response. Patricia watched me with the focused attention she typically reserved for potential social threats. "I recognized an opportunity that others missed," I finally explained, keeping my tone conversational. "Brighton Automotive was in a vulnerable position financially. Westfield Industries was looking to expand in exactly that market sector. I simply connected those realities in a way that benefited all stakeholders." "All stakeholders," Patricia repeated, spearing a piece of lettuce precisely. "An interesting choice of words. I wouldn't have thought David's interests were particularly well served by losing his family legacy and executive position. There it was, the maternal defense I had anticipated from the beginning. Patricia had always protected David, making excuses for his shortcomings while holding everyone else to impossible standards. David's interests were served by receiving fair market value for his shares before the company's position deteriorated further, I countered calmly. As for the family legacy, that was already compromised by decisions made long before my involvement. In the sale. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. You're referring to Edward's financial management. Among other factors, yes. She set down her fork and dabbed at her lips with her napkin, a gesture I recognized as her method of regaining composure when conversations took unexpected turns. I've been at Brighton for 43 years, she said after a moment. I've watched Edward build the company from a modest regional supplier to what it became at its peak. I've hosted countless business dinners, attended hundreds of charity events, maintained relationships with clients and competitors alike. She looked at me directly. Yet in all that time, I was never permitted to see the actual financial statements, never included in strategic discussions, never treated as anything more than a social accessory to the Brighton success story. The admission was startling in its unexpected candor. Patricia Brighton had always embodied the role of corporate wife, so perfectly that I'd never considered she might chafe against its limitations. I didn't know, I said honestly. No one did. That was the point. She took another sip of tea. When Edward finally told me about the company's financial troubles, after the sale was already completed, I realized I'd spent 4 decades building my identity around a facade. I studied her with new interest, recognizing aspects of my own experience reflected in hers. Is that why you wanted to meet? To tell me this? Partly, she acknowledged. But also because I want to understand how you managed what I never could, to see beyond the Brighton mystique to the business realities underneath, to use that knowledge effectively. The conversation had taken a turn I could never have anticipated. Patricia Brighton, the woman who had subtly made me feel inadequate for years, was now asking for my insight. I refused to accept the limitations placed on my role, I explained carefully. When David and Edward dismissed my interest in the business as inappropriate or unnecessary, I found alternative ways to gather information. I built relationships with people they overlooked, administrative staff, warehouse managers, long-time suppliers. I read every document I could access, attended industry conferences independently, and studied the market landscape. Patricia nodded slowly. You created your own education while appearing to accept their constraints. Essentially, yes. And the legal mechanism? Edward mentioned something about proxy voting rights. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But Patricia's unexpected vulnerability deserved some measure of honesty in return. David signed over his proxy rights early in our marriage, I explained. He found the administrative aspects of share ownership tedious and wanted me to handle the paperwork while he focused on more interesting pursuits. He never bothered to revoke that arrangement after we separated. And the other family shareholders? Eleanor and Michael? Had their own motivations for cooperating, I confirmed. Financial concerns primarily, and a lack of attention from the main branch of the Brighton family until it was convenient to need their support. Patricia actually smiled at this, a genuine expression I'd rarely seen directed at me. You identified the weak points in the family dynamics as well as the business structure. Impressive. Our salads remained largely untouched as the conversation continued, both of us more interested in this unexpected exchange than in the perfectly prepared food. May I ask why you've really invited me here, Patricia? Beyond curiosity about my methods? She considered me for a long moment before responding. The Brighton name still means something in certain circles, despite what's happened with the company. I've spent too many years building social capital to see it entirely squandered. She straightened her silverware precisely. I wanted to understand your intentions going forward. Whether you're Dissatisfaction with how you were treated extends to further actions that might affect the family's standing. I understood then. She was assessing whether I posed an ongoing threat to the Brighton social position, whether I planned to share damaging information about the company's financial mismanagement or David's personal conduct with their wider social circle. My focus is on my future, not your family's past, I assured her. The business transaction is complete. My marriage to David is ending. I have no interest in causing further disruption to the Brighton name. Relief flickered briefly across her features. Thank you for that. Despite everything, there are charitable initiatives and community relationships worth preserving. Our waiter approached discreetly. Will there be anything else, Mrs. Brighton? Patricia glanced at our barely touched salads and made a small dismissive gesture. Just the check, Thomas. Thank you. As he departed, she turned back to me with an appraising, Look, Victoria Chen has offered you a position at Westfield, I understand. The Brighton Information Network remained efficient, even in the aftermath of the company sale. News travels quickly. Edward mentioned it. He seemed quite impressed with her assessment of your capabilities. She raised an eyebrow slightly. Quite a change from his previous evaluation. Yes, I acknowledged. Perspective shifts can be quite dramatic when circumstances change. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. Will you accept the position? I plan to call Victoria this afternoon to do exactly that. Good. Her approval seemed genuine rather than performative. The business world needs more women who understand how to navigate its complexities without being consumed by them. Coming from Patricia Brighton, who had spent decades embodying the corporate wife archetype without publicly challenging its limitations, the statement carried unexpected weight. As we prepared to leave, Patricia hesitated, then reached into her handbag and removed a small jewelry box. I brought something for you. I accepted it cautiously, opening the lid to find a pair of sapphire earrings I recognized from family events, an heirloom piece that Patricia had often worn for significant occasions. These were given to me by Edward's mother when we married, she explained. Brighton tradition dictated they be passed to David's wife. I held on to them thinking... She paused, the implication clear. Thinking I wasn't truly worthy of the family heritage. Patricia, I can't accept these now. I closed the box gently. Our connection to the Brighton family is ending. That's precisely why I want you to have them, she insisted. Not as Brighton heirlooms tied to family obligation, but as recognition between women who both discovered the limitations of the roles we were expected to play. She pushed the box firmly toward me. Consider it acknowledgement of what you've accomplished. I studied her, trying to discern her true motivation. What I saw surprised me. Genuine respect, perhaps even a hint of admiration from the woman who had once represented everything I was expected to become, but never quite managed to be. Thank you, I said finally, tucking the box into my purse. I appreciate the gesture. As we parted in the club's circular driveway, Patricia surprised me once more. Rebecca, she called as I reached my car. Whatever happens with David this afternoon, remember that you've already won the more important battle. I drove away from the Greenwich Country Club for what would likely be the last time, considering Patricia's unexpected alliance and the meeting with David that still lay ahead. The familiar landmarks of the life I had shared with him seemed somehow diminished now, not because they had changed, but because I no longer measured my worth by my proximity to them. The sapphire earrings rested in my purse, transformed from symbols of Brighton family inclusion to recognition of my successful escape from its limitations. Patricia had given me something I never expected. Acknowledgement that the very qualities the Brighton men had dismissed as threatening were precisely what had allowed me to outmaneuver them. As I merged onto the highway toward my afternoon appointment, with David, I felt a curious sense of completion, not just regarding the business transaction, but about my own journey from accommodating wife to architect of my own destiny. The conversation with David was no longer something I approached with trepidation or lingering emotion, but simply the final administrative detail in a chapter already effectively concluded. The lake at Wilson Park created a natural sanctuary in the midst of the city, its serene surface reflecting the spring clouds and surrounding trees. I arrived 15 minutes early for my meeting with David, deliberate timing that allowed me to choose the specific bench rather than leaving the selection to him. Not the one where he had proposed 5 years ago. That would have played into his penchant for nostalgic manipulation, but a different one with a clearer view of both the water and the park entrance. I watched him approach from a distance, noting how different he appeared from the confidently smug man who had brought Melissa to our anniversary dinner just 4 days ago. His normally perfect hair was unstyled, his clothing casual rather than the carefully curated business attire he typically wore even on weekends. He walked with uncharacteristic hesitation, scanning the park until he spotted me. "Thank you for coming," he said as he reached the bench, hovering awkwardly before sitting beside me. He left a careful distance between us, as though uncertain of the appropriate protocol for meeting with the wife who had orchestrated the sale of his family business. "You wanted to talk," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "So, talk." David stared, out at the lake, perhaps gathering his thoughts or simply avoiding my direct gaze. "I met with the Westfield transition team this morning," he finally said. "They were very clear about my position, or lack of one, in the new structure." I nodded, unsurprised. Victoria Chen had mentioned their plans to eliminate redundant executive positions, particularly those with limited operational contributions. David's role had been primarily ceremonial for years, his actual responsibilities handled by others while he collected the salary and prestige that came with his family name. "They offered me a consultant contract," he continued, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. 6 months at reduced compensation to help with client transitions. After that, he shrugged. "Nothing." "That's fairly standard in acquisitions," I noted, especially when the acquired company's leadership structure was top-heavy. He caught my meaning, his jaw tightening momentarily before he exhaled slowly. "You knew that would happen." I anticipated it, yes. A jogger passed by momentarily, interrupting our conversation. David watched them disappear around the lake's curve before speaking again. "Melissa left," he said abruptly. "She said she needed space to process everything after the anniversary dinner." His attempt at a laugh came out as something closer to a wince. Apparently finding out I wasn't technically separated yet and had just lost my family business in the same evening was too much drama for her. I felt no satisfaction at this news, only a mild curiosity about whether Melissa had genuinely cared for David or had simply been attracted to the lifestyle and status he represented. Either way, her departure seemed an inevitable recalibration now that those external factors had been compromised. "I'm sorry," I offered, the polite response rather than the genuine sentiment. David turned to face me directly for the first time since sitting down. "Are you sorry about any of this?" The question deserved honest consideration. Was I sorry for orchestrating the sale that had protected employees' jobs while extracting fair market value for shareholders before the company's decline accelerated? Was I sorry for leveraging legal rights that David had carelessly granted me while dismissing my business acumen? Was I sorry for finally demonstrating the capabilities that the Brighton family had consistently undervalued? "I'm sorry it became necessary," I answered carefully. "I'm sorry that protecting Brighton Automotive's value required such dramatic measures. But no, I'm not sorry for the actions I took once those circumstances became clear." He absorbed this, nodding slightly as though he'd expected nothing different. "Dad says the company wouldn't have survived another year without the sale. That you actually negotiated a better deal than he could have." A reluctant admiration colored his voice. "He says I should have listened to you more, about everything." It was the closest David Brighton had ever come to acknowledging his own accountability in both our failed marriage and his diminished role in the family business. Yet, it still framed his recognition through his father's assessment, rather than his own realization, still measuring my worth through another man's evaluation. Edward has always been practical about business matters, I noted. Once he understood the company's actual position, he recognized the necessity of the transaction. And us? David gestured vaguely between us. Was that also a practical business matter? The question held echoes of his accusation at the anniversary dinner, that I had orchestrated the company sale as emotional revenge rather than strategic necessity. Even now, he struggled to separate the professional from the personal, to see me as someone whose actions might be guided by business logic rather than romantic sentiment. Our marriage ended when you decided it had, I reminded him. The company transaction was entirely separate, a business decision based on financial realities and market opportunities. That you never discussed with me. Would you have listened? I asked directly. 5 years of marriage demonstrated quite clearly how much value you placed on my business insights. He had the grace to look away, unable to dispute the truth of my assessment. During our entire relationship, David had consistently dismissed my professional capabilities, treating my education and experience as charming but ultimately irrelevant to the serious business of running Brighton Automotive. You could have tried, he offered weakly. I did try, David. For years. You weren't interested until it affected you directly. A comfortable silence settled between us as we both watched a family of ducks navigate the lake's edge. The small ducklings, following their mother in perfect, trusting formation. The parallel to how I had once followed David's lead, accepting his dismissals, adapting to his expectations, trusting his assessment of my capabilities, was impossible to miss. What happens now? He finally asked, the same question he had posed at the anniversary dinner, but now with resignation rather than anger. Our attorneys finalized the divorce agreement. Westfield completes the integration of Brighton Automotive. We both move forward with our separate lives. I turned to face him directly. It's actually quite straightforward. Nothing about this feels straightforward, he admitted. I keep wondering when you became this. He gestured vaguely toward me. This person who could outmaneuver my father, restructure our entire family business, walk away from everything we built together, without looking back. His framing was revealing, the assumption that I had suddenly transformed rather than finally revealed capabilities I had always possessed but strategically concealed. The inability to recognize that everything we built together had primarily been constructed through my efforts while he collected the recognition. I was always this person, David. You just never bothered to look closely enough to see it. He absorbed this with a thoughtful nod, perhaps truly hearing me for the first time in our relationship. I underestimated you. We all did. Yes, I agreed simply. You did. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting longer shadows across the park. Soon I would need to leave for my call with Victoria Chen to formally accept the position at Westfield Industries. This conversation with David, which I had once imagined would be emotionally charged and complicated, was reaching its natural conclusion with surprising simplicity. For what it's worth, he said hesitantly. I am sorry. For how I treated you during our marriage, for bringing Melissa to our anniversary dinner, for never recognizing what you were capable of. The apology held a certain sincerity, though it came far too late to carry real meaning. Still, it represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't expected from him, perhaps the beginning of growth catalyzed by the drastic disruption of his comfortable narrative. Thank you for saying that, I acknowledged, standing to signal the conversation's end. I hope you find a way forward that brings you genuine fulfillment, David, beyond the Brighton name and all it represented. He looked up at me, suddenly vulnerable, in a way I'd rarely seen during our marriage. Are you really taking the position at Westfield? I am. Victoria's been quite convincing about how my experience could benefit their acquisition strategy. You'll be good at it, he admitted. A simple acknowledgement that would have meant the world to me once, but now felt merely factual. Better than I was at running Brighton Automotive. I smiled slightly at this belated recognition. Goodbye, David. As I walked away from the bench, from the lake, from the man who had once represented my entire future, I felt neither triumph nor regret. Only the quiet certainty of moving toward a life defined by my own capabilities rather than someone else's limitations. David had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, unaware that I had just sold his family's business. But the real story wasn't about what he had lost. It was about what I had finally claimed for myself. 6 months after the sale of Brighton Automotive Supply, I stood at the window of my new office at Westfield Industries, watching the autumn leaves dance across the corporate plaza 40 floors below. The transition had been completed 3 weeks ahead of schedule, with remarkable efficiency that validated Westfield's reputation for strategic integration. Brighton Automotive now existed only as a division name on organizational charts, its operations fully absorbed into Westfield's larger structure. My role as Director of Family Business Acquisitions had already proven more satisfying than I had anticipated. In the past 5 months, I had led negotiations for 2 additional acquisitions of family-owned manufacturing companies, facing challenges similar to Brighton Automotive, with ownership structures vulnerable to the same strategic approach. The insights gained from my experience with the Brighton transaction had proven invaluable, allowing me to identify opportunities others missed and structure deals that protected employees while extracting maximum value for all stakeholders. Your 3 o'clock is here, my assistant announced through the intercom. The Nelson family from Milwaukee. Thank you, Mark. Please show them in. I moved from the window to my desk, reviewing my notes on Nelson Tool & Die, a third-generation manufacturer of specialized metalworking components, currently experiencing succession challenges as the founding family's grandchildren showed limited interest in continuing the business. The company's market position remained strong, but without clear leadership transition, its future had become uncertain. The situation felt familiar. Another family business where tradition and emotional attachment complicated necessary strategic decisions. But unlike Edward Brighton, Walter Nelson had recognized the warning signs early enough to explore options while the company retained significant value. My preliminary conversations with him had revealed a pragmatic businessman more concerned with his employees' future security than with preserving the family name on the building. As the Nelson family entered my office, Walter, his wife Eleanor, and their daughter Susan, who served as CFO, I greeted them with genuine warmth. Their situation resonated with me differently than the Brighton acquisition had. This wasn't about reclaiming my value or demonstrating overlooked capabilities. It was about helping another family navigate a transition that honored their business legacy while securing its future. Thank you for making the trip from Milwaukee. I gestured toward the conference area of my office where refreshments waited. I've reviewed the materials Susan sent over, and I believe we have several promising options to discuss. While we settled into our conversation about valuation models and integration possibilities, my phone buzzed silently with a text from Catherine. Dinner still on for tonight? James is excited to meet the famous Rebecca who orchestrated the Brighton acquisition. I smiled slightly, looking forward to meeting Catherine's brother who is visiting from London. My social circle had expanded significantly in recent months, no longer confined to the Brighton family connections that had dominated my previous life. The freedom to build relationships based on genuine connection rather than strategic advantage had been one of the most unexpected benefits of my professional transition. Walter Nelson was explaining his concerns about employee retention during any ownership change, a priority that demonstrated precisely the kind of leadership integrity Brighton Automotive had lacked in its final years. I focused fully on the discussion, offering reassurance about Westfield's approach to workforce transitions and commitment to preserving institutional knowledge. Later that evening, as I prepared for dinner with Catherine and her brother, I reflected on how dramatically my life had transformed since that pivotal anniversary dinner. The woman who had sat across from David and Melissa at Bellini's, controlling her reactions while holding life-changing information, seemed almost like a character in someone else's story now, recognizable but increasingly distant from who I had become. My doorbell rang precisely at 7. Catherine's punctuality had improved remarkably since our brunch conversation months ago, one of many small adjustments in our friendship as we both evolved into new versions of ourselves. She had recently been promoted to senior counsel at her law firm, a position she attributed partly to the confidence gained from watching me navigate the Brighton situation with such strategic precision. "Rebecca," she embraced me warmly before introducing her brother. "This is James. He's been absolutely fascinated by what little I've told him about the Brighton acquisition." James, who shared Catherine's sharp features and direct manner, smiled as he shook my hand. Catherine's been deliberately vague on the details, claiming attorney-client privilege. "I'm hoping you might be willing to share more over dinner." I laughed, appreciating his straightforward approach. "Some aspects remain confidential, of course, but I'm happy to discuss the strategic elements. It's become something of a case study in our department." As we headed to the restaurant, Catherine updated me on mutual acquaintances, including the news that Melissa had recently launched a modest fashion blog focusing on accessible luxury, rather than the high-end content she had envisioned while with David. The information registered as a neutral fact rather than triggering any emotional response, further evidence of my complete detachment from the Brighton narrative. The restaurant Catherine had chosen was new to the city's dining scene, its innovative menu and contemporary design representing everything the traditional establishments favored by the Brighton family were not. We settled at a corner table with views of both the open kitchen and the vibrant dining room. To new beginnings, Catherine proposed a toast once our wine had been poured, and to remembering that the best revenge isn't about looking backward at what you've escaped, but forward to what you're creating. I clinked my glass against hers, then James's, appreciating the sentiment while gently correcting its premise. "Not revenge," I reminded her with a smile. "Strategic repositioning." James laughed appreciatively. "I like that framing much better. Revenge suggests emotional motivation. Strategic repositioning acknowledges intentional reclamation of value." "Exactly," I agreed, suddenly aware of how completely I had internalized this perspective. What had begun as a necessary reframing to distance myself from David's accusations had evolved into my genuine understanding of what had transpired. Not an emotional response to betrayal, but a strategic recognition and leveraging of opportunity. Our conversation flowed easily through dinner, touching on business strategy, legal complexities, and London's corporate landscape where James worked as an investment advisor. The evening held none of the careful social positioning or strategic networking that had characterized similar outings during my marriage to David. Just the simple pleasure of engaging conversation with people who saw me clearly and valued what they saw. "Have you heard anything from David recently?" Catherine asked as we finished dessert, her curiosity finally overcoming her restraint. "Nothing direct," I replied honestly. "Victoria mentioned he's taken a position with a startup in San Francisco, something in sustainable manufacturing. Apparently, a complete departure from the Brighton family business." "Good for him," James observed, surprising me slightly. Reinvention after that kind of public restructuring takes genuine courage. Most people in his position would cling to familiar patterns rather than risking something new. His perspective was unexpectedly generous, and perhaps more insightful than my own had been. In focusing on my transition, I had given little thought to what David's path forward might require of him. The loss of his family company, position, and identity as a Brighton executive represented a significant disruption to his life narrative, regardless of how that disruption had been necessitated by his own choices. "You're right," I acknowledged. "It does take courage to start over, especially after defining yourself through inheritance rather than creation for so long." As we parted ways after dinner, James expressed interest in continuing our conversation during his next visit to the city. The possibility of a personal connection unrelated to my previous life felt refreshingly uncomplicated. Another step in the ongoing process of defining myself on my own terms. My apartment welcomed me with peaceful silence as I returned home, its space arranged exactly as I preferred without accommodation to anyone else's tastes or requirements. The freedom to create my environment according to my own preferences had been among the first and most tangible benefits of reclaiming my independence. On my desk lay the contract for the Nelson family acquisition, nearly finalized after today's productive meeting. Beside it rested Patricia Brighton's sapphire earrings, which I had decided to wear tomorrow, not as a reminder of the Brighton legacy, but as acknowledgement of my journey from accommodation to agency. 6 months ago, David had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, unaware that I had just sold his family's business. Today, that event existed in my mind not as the dramatic climax it had once seemed, but merely as the necessary catalyst for the life I was now creating. One decision point in a continuing journey of strategic repositioning that had only just begun. 1 year to the day after that fateful anniversary dinner, I found myself back at Bellini's. The restaurant hadn't changed. Same elegant lighting, same impeccable service, same quiet luxury that had once represented everything I thought I wanted. What had changed, profoundly, was me. I wasn't there to commemorate the anniversary of my separation from David or the sale of Brighton Automotive. Those milestones had receded in importance as new achievements took their place. My first solo acquisition at Westfield had closed last week, a family-owned manufacturing business that I had identified, negotiated, and integrated without Victoria's oversight. The Nelson deal had become a case study at Westfield for seamless transitions, preserving both jobs and operational expertise while maximizing shareholder value. "Ms. Reed?" The maitre d' approached with perfect deference. I had reverted to my maiden name when the divorce finalized, another reclamation of my pre-Brighton identity. "Your guest has arrived." I nodded, straightening the lapel of my charcoal suit, tailored to my preferences rather than Brighton's social expectations. Walter Nelson approached my table, his expression brightening when he saw me. After our successful business transaction, we had developed an unexpected friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of family business dynamics. "Rebecca," he greeted me warmly, taking the seat opposite mine. "I can't thank you enough for agreeing to this meeting." "Your message intrigued me," I admitted, genuinely curious about his request to discuss a new venture. The waiter brought Walter's scotch and refreshed my sparkling water. As he departed, Walter leaned forward slightly. "I've been approached by several former Brighton Automotive executives," he explained. "They've formed a new manufacturing collective and want me to invest. They mentioned you were instrumental in preserving jobs during the Westfield transition. I hadn't expected this connection to my past." "Which executives?" "Marcus Chen from operations, Elaine Winters from supply chain, and James Davidson from product development." I smiled, recognizing these names immediately. All three had been exceptional talents at Brighton Automotive, consistently undervalued by Edward and David despite their critical contributions. They had been among the first people I'd identified for retention during the Westfield integration. "They're extremely capable," I confirmed. "What's their concept?" "Specialized automotive components focusing on electric vehicle applications. They've secured patents for battery housing technology that improves efficiency by 14%. Walter's eyes held genuine excitement. "They asked specifically if I knew how to reach you. Not for investment, they're adequately capitalized, but for advice on structuring the new venture to avoid the pitfalls Brighton experienced. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very people who had been sidelined within the Brighton hierarchy now sought my guidance on building something that would potentially compete with Westfield's automotive division. I'm not sure my position at Westfield would allow for such consultation, I said carefully. Walter nodded, understanding. They anticipated that concern. They're proposing a supplier relationship, not competition. They believe your perspective would be valuable precisely because you understand both sides of the equation now. As we discussed the details, I felt a curious sense of completion forming. The expertise I had developed through my experience with Brighton Automotive, both its failures and the successful transition to Westfield, could now help create something entirely new, something built on a foundation of authentic value rather than family legacy. I'd need to disclose any consultation to Victoria, I noted, and ensure no conflicts of interest. Of course, Walter agreed. Transparency above all. Later, as I walked out of Bellini's, I paused at the exact table where David had brought Melissa 1 year ago, where I had sat calmly knowing I had just fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Brighton legacy. My phone chimed with a text from Catherine. How was the mysterious meeting? I typed back. Interesting. The past and future have found an unexpected intersection. 1 year ago, I had executed a strategic repositioning that many had interpreted as revenge. Today, I recognized it as something far more significant. Not an ending, but a beginning. The skills I had developed while being underestimated had become the foundation for a career built on recognizing true value, both in business and in myself. David had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner, unaware that I had just sold his family's business. But the ultimate outcome wasn't the dismantling of what he valued. It was the creation of something more authentic and sustainable than the Brighton legacy had ever been. Now, fragments of that former world were reassembling into something new, with my guidance rather than despite my involvement. As I stepped into the spring evening, I realized that the most satisfying resolution wasn't watching something end, but helping something better begin. Not revenge, but renaissance.